Paul and Tanya first met at a trivia night, having been roped into the same team by mutual friends. From the get-go, Paul was drawn to Tanya's serene presence and thoughtful way of speaking. Just a week after their initial meeting, sparks had already flown. They dove headfirst into a relationship, leaving everyone stunned when they tied the knot barely 3 months later. Their families raised eyebrows. Some even voiced concerns, but Paul and Tanya stood firm, convinced they were doing what felt right. They skipped the fanfare of a grand wedding, choosing instead a quiet courthouse ceremony, followed by a spontaneous seaside getaway. Through a year and a half of shared life, they never once questioned the path they'd chosen. But as life would have it, things shifted. A new twist in their story forced them to live apart for a while. Paul had a job he couldn't walk away from, and Tanya had to return home to care for her ailing mother and sort through some complicated family matters. What she thought would be a brief visit turned into an open-ended stay. Even so, they found comfort in the fact that the cities weren't too far apart, close enough, at least, to spend weekends and holidays together. They clung to plans for the future, counting down the days until they'd be under one roof again, often dreaming aloud about starting a family and stepping into a new chapter together. During this drawn-out period apart, Tanya felt drained emotionally and physically by the relentless demands of her situation. Looking for a bit of peace and a mental escape, she wandered into a bookstore one afternoon. She hadn't expected anything unusual, but fate had other plans. That's where she ran into Eli. At first, she kept her distance, not looking to strike up any kind of conversation, but Eli had a quiet persistence about him. Eventually, she let her guard down. He offered up some book suggestions, then invited her to grab a coffee at a nearby cafe. She couldn't quite explain why she said yes. Part of her felt uneasy, but there was something comforting in his company. Eli turned out to be a captivating storyteller. He spoke about his work, his time studying in the capital, and his eventual move back to their hometown. When it came time to part ways, Tanya was surprised by the pang of sadness she felt. On impulse, she asked for his contact information, not ready to say goodbye just yet. There was something about his warm smile that lingered in her mind long after they'd parted. Not long after, their chats turned into regular calls and messages. He brought a flicker of light into the dim corners of her routine, a joy she kept hidden from Paul. To avoid suspicion, she told Paul she'd reconnected with an old school friend. He, in turn, felt reassured that she had someone to lean on, unaware of the real story. What he didn't know was that Tanya and Eli had started meeting in secret. He'd take her out for coffee, gift her books he thought she'd like, and even once whisked her away to a quiet spot by the water to watch the sunset. As they sat by the shoreline, talking deep into the night, Tanya felt a sudden, powerful urge to kiss him. After that evening, their meeting shifted, no longer just friendly catch-ups, but something far more intimate. Back at home, Paul began to sense a change. Tanya's messages lost their usual tone. No more long-winded complaints about her sisters or how drained she felt. Instead, her texts grew vague, peppered with excuses and half-hearted updates. Something was off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Not until Tanya's older sister, Kate, happened to spot her outside a restaurant, locked in an affectionate embrace with a man who wasn't her husband. The tension between the sisters stretched far back into their childhood, rooted in years of quiet rivalry and unresolved slights. Kate had always found subtle, often irritating ways to get under Tanya's skin. So when she spotted her younger sister out with a man who clearly wasn't Paul, it felt like an opportunity she couldn't resist. From the privacy of her parked car, Kate snapped a few discreet photos. They were grainy and hastily taken, but unmistakable. Tanya, smiling, seated far too close to a man who wasn't her husband. Without a second thought, Kate forwarded the images to Paul. Moments later, his number lit up her phone. "Who is that?" Paul demanded, his voice clipped with disbelief. With a smirk, Kate drawled, "Isn't that your darling wife?" Disgusted by her tone, Paul ended the call without another word. He stared at the images for a long time, willing himself to see something, anything, that might explain it away. But no matter how he tried to rationalize it, a knot twisted in his gut. Something was off, and he couldn't shake the feeling. Driven by a mix of dread and determination, Paul decided to find out the truth for himself. He took a few days off work, kept his plans quiet, and rented a car to follow Tanya without her noticing. It didn't take long to track her movements. On one particular afternoon, she headed out claiming she was meeting a friend. Paul followed at a distance, his heart pounding. Eventually, she arrived at a restaurant, and Paul parked a few spaces away. Watching from behind the tinted glass, through the large windows, he saw her walk inside. The man from the photos was already there, waiting. Tanya greeted him with a warm smile and leaned in for a kiss. They sat down, clearly relaxed in each other's company, chatting and flipping through the menu like this was something they did all the time. Paul's hands clenched around the steering wheel. The sight of his wife, his Tanya, laughing with another man, exchanging glances only lovers would share, made his blood boil. He couldn't sit and watch any longer. With a burst of resolve, he threw open the car door and marched straight into the restaurant. "Well, well," Paul said loudly as he approached their table, his voice cutting through the hum of conversation. Tanya jerked in surprise, nearly knocking over her glass. "Paul," she gasped, eyes wide. Paul turned to the man beside her, thrusting out a hand with a tense smile. "Hi there, I'm Paul, Tanya's husband. Nice to meet you." Eli froze. His face went pale as he glanced from Paul to Tanya, clearly at a loss for words. His lips parted, but nothing came out, just a silent struggle to respond, like a fish plucked from water. Around them, diners began to quiet. Forks paused midair, and a thick silence settled over the room. All eyes were locked on the uncomfortable triangle at the center of the restaurant. Tanya's cheeks burned bright with embarrassment. Without uttering a single word, she snatched up her purse and darted out into the street. The two men hurried after her, but Paul's voice stopped her in her tracks. "Wait," he called out, his tone firm but pleading. "We need to talk." Eli vanished quickly, leaving Paul and Tanya alone in the fading light. Paul suggested they get in the car to hash things out, and after a moment's hesitation, Tanya reluctantly agreed. Once inside the car, the silence hung heavy until Paul finally broke it, demanding answers. "Why did you do this? Why lie to me?" Tanya said nothing. She just shrugged, her shoulders lifting as if to say she had no explanation. That shrug, so cold, so empty, set Paul's blood on fire. His anger bubbled up, hard to hold back any longer. "Do you love me?" he asked softly, hoping against hope for some clarity. Again, Tanya shrugged. That indifference cut him deeper than any harsh word could. Paul couldn't wrap his head around not knowing if you loved someone or not. To him, love was black or white, either yes or no. If she didn't know, that meant no. She was just too scared to admit it. "He gets it," Paul muttered, starting the engine and driving toward Tanya's parents' house. Oddly, a strange calm settled over him. A weight lifted, as if he'd finally faced the truth and could breathe again. For the first time, he wondered if their rushed marriage had been a terrible mistake, and now everything seemed to be falling into place. He told Tanya he'd bring her things over the weekend and suggested they go to the registry office to file for divorce. Tanya stayed silent, her quiet consent speaking volumes. She tried calling Eli countless times, but he never picked up. Eventually, a message came through. He couldn't see her anymore. The betrayal of her hidden marriage was too much. Tanya's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Picking up those fragments and moving forward took a long, painful stretch of time. When she found out her sister had spilled everything to Paul, she made a harsh choice. She cut ties with her family completely. She wanted nothing to do with any of them. After the divorce, Paul disappeared from Tanya's life too, but through mutual friends, he learned she'd moved to the capital for work and wiped nearly everyone out of her contact list. Though he knew their marriage had been flawed from the start, Paul was quietly relieved that he'd walked away relatively unscathed.